thank you very much for having me here tonight. So I am excited to talk to Epic, and the talk title that I'm going to use is Christian Faith, Philosophy, and Ethics. And so you might have seen Venn diagrams before where you've got overlapping circles. I see these three things as often able to overlap, but often able to pull apart. So you may have heard of John Calvin and Thomas Hobbes, right? One a Swiss reformer and one a British political philosopher. But have you also heard of Calvin and Hobbes, the cartoon characters by Bill Watterson? I've got a nice little cartoon that I think starts off things tonight. I'll have to read what they say because it may be small for those in the back. So the child, Calvin, says up in the top left-hand corner, I'll have to read from here. Today at school, I tried to decide whether to cheat on my test or not. And the child continues, I wondered, is it better to do the right thing and fail, or is it better to do the wrong thing and succeed? On the one hand, undeserved success gives no satisfaction. But on the other hand, well-deserved failure gives no satisfaction either. He continues, of course, most everybody cheats sometime or other. People always bend the rules if they think they can get away with it. Then again, that doesn't justify my cheating. Then I thought, look, cheating on one little test isn't such a big deal. It doesn't hurt anyone. But then I wondered if I was just rationalizing my unwillingness to accept the consequence of not studying. You know, Hobbes is just puzzling over this, but Calvin continues, still, in the real world, people care about success, not principles. Then again, maybe that's why the world is in such a mess. What a dilemma. And so Hobbes finally asks him, so what did you decide? And then Calvin says, nothing. I ran out of time and had to turn in a blank paper. And then Hobbes says, anymore, simply acknowledging the issue is a moral victory. And then Calvin says, well, it seemed wrong to cheat on an ethics test. So let me give you a slightly worrier slide to tell you about three different ways of characterizing the nature of philosophy. I'll rifle through these. The first way is to focus just on the origins of the word philosophy. Many of you know the Greek word philein, to love, adds to the Greek word sophia for wisdom, and then you get a philosopher as a lover of wisdom. So ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates sought wisdom regarding truth, knowledge, beauty, and goodness. And so philosophy is sometimes defined as the attempt to think rationally and critically about life's most important questions in order to obtain knowledge and wisdom about them. Okay, but there's a second way, and I'll give you a third in just the next slide, that people talk about the nature of philosophy, and that is by observing that philosophy can be what some people call a second-order discipline. So the idea is it's possible to have a philosophy of X, where X can be any discipline, whatever, like law. There's a philosophy of law, or religion, philosophy of religion, or biology, philosophy of biology. And when philosophers examine X to formulate a philosophy of X, they typically do a couple things. They try to ask questions about X that are sometimes called normative questions, basically saying, look, what should one believe in the discipline of X and why? They also analyze and criticize different assumptions underlying the discipline X. They try to clarify concepts within X, and then they try to integrate X with other fields. But let me give you a third characterization of philosophy besides just the love of wisdom or it's a second-order discipline, and that is you can characterize it just by listing some of the different sub-branches that many of you may be familiar with from classes that you've taken. There's the branch of philosophy called logic, which just looks at principles of right reasoning and asks questions like this one. When can a conclusion legitimately be drawn from premises and why? There's also the branch called epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and justified belief. It asks questions like, how do we know things and justify our beliefs? Then there's the branch that sometimes gets called metaphysics, and it's the study of being or reality. It asks questions like, what are the ultimate kinds of things that exist? And then there's a branch called value theory, which is often the study of value, especially ethical value or aesthetic value. What does it mean to say something is right and wrong, or beautiful and ugly, and so on. So the next couple of slides are going to have a lot of pictures in them, but they go with a one-page handout that I've brought that raises 4 different questions. And I'll go ahead and...
I could do that.
Oh, sure, thanks. The first question that I put on this little handout is, how does Christian faith intersect with philosophy and ethics? Now, this in some ways is a very big question, but I'm going to give it just a fairly short treatment. And this is a picture of St. Paul, not a photographically accurate one. Raphael painted it about 1,500 years later, but delivering a sermon in Athens, thank you, at Mars Hill, or the Areopagus. This is recorded in Acts chapter 17 when Paul is preaching to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Now, one of the things that I put on this sheet is a quote from the Apostle Paul in Colossians 2:8. Paul says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and on the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ." Now, I agree with many Christian thinkers, including J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig, who put together a book that I'll pass around in a minute called Philosophical Foundations of a Christian Worldview. And what they say about Paul's words in Colossians 2:8 is that if you investigate the structure of this verse, it becomes clear that the words hollow and deceptive go together with philosophy. That is, vain and hostile philosophy was the subject of Paul's discussion, not all philosophy per se. So in the context of Colossians, Paul was warning the church not to form and base its doctrinal views according to a philosophical system that was hostile to orthodoxy. Paul's remarks were a simple warning not to embrace heresy. They were not meant to represent the apostles' views of philosophy as a discipline of study. Those views are not really relevant to the context and do not square with the grammar of the passage. So Paul does say in 2 Corinthians 10:4 and 5, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Now, that second passage from 2 Corinthians is similar to a little quote I put on the handout from C.S. Lewis. And it's a quote that comes from an essay some of you have probably run into before called Learning in Wartime. He's trying to address the question, why should people study at Oxford and Cambridge when there's a world war going on? And part of his argument in this is a longer quote that I took the short quote from. So let me read you that sort of paragraph. C.S. Lewis says, if all the world were Christian, it might not matter if all the world were uneducated. But as it is, a cultural life will exist outside the church, whether it exists inside the church or not. To be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemies on their own ground, would be to throw down our weapons and to betray our uneducated brethren who have, under God, no defense but us against the intellectual attacks of the heathen. Good philosophy must exist, and this is the money quote on your sheet, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. The cool intellect must work not only against cool intellect on the other side, but against the muddy heathen mysticisms which deny intellect altogether. Most of all, perhaps, we need intimate knowledge of the past, not that the past has any magic about it, but because we cannot study the future, and yet need something to set against the present, to remind us that the basic assumptions have been quite different in different periods, and that much of what seems certain to the uneducated is merely temporary fashion. A man who has lived in many places is not likely to be deceived by the local errors of his native village. The scholar has lived in many times and is therefore in some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and the microphone of his own age. So Lewis is convinced that good philosophy can have a place, and if it's just to answer bad philosophy, that's a pretty important place to occupy. Now, I'm going to give you 7 quick reasons that some have said there's a Christian justification for philosophy, and I won't go through each in detail, but I will pass around my first prop of the evening. And that is this book, Philosophical Foundations of a Christian Worldview. They recently, just earlier today, celebrated their 20th anniversary of this book on YouTube. And I can send Anne the link if she wants it. But these gentlemen have put together a book that I think is a very good book for people to know about. And I'll let you pass it around and be distracted by it.
Is it listed on here?
Oh, that's a good question. I believe it may be listed on there. Let me see. Oh, no, that's my bad. I didn't list this one on there because I haven't actually taught from it in my classes before. So you may want to take your phone out and snap a picture of it. The first reason they give is that philosophy can aid in apologetics, the task of being willing to give a reason for the hope that is within us, giving a reasoned defense of the Christian faith, and also offering positive evidence for people to adopt it themselves. A second reason they give is that philosophy can aid in the task of polemics, which is a name that has been given to the attempt for Christians to explain why other alternative views of the world are not as good as the Christian view. A third reason is that philosophy can be a central expression of the image of God in human beings. People have long discussions about what the image of God is made up of, but the ability to reason and be creative and to be thoughtful is one that many Christians have said that connects up with philosophy in the best uses of the word. So a fourth reason is that philosophy permeates systematic theology. When people are thinking through the different areas of their own statement of faith and trying to systematize it for the sake of the church, philosophy has often been seen as a handmaiden to that task. Fifth, philosophy can aid the spiritual discipline of study, whether you're studying the scriptures or whether you're studying something else. The task of philosophy can also assist in that. Sixth and seventh, philosophy can enhance the boldness and the self-image of the Christian community. Many historians have said that, especially within the first 300 years when Christian believers were a minority in a sort of a hostile Greco-Roman context, the fact that their church pastors and other thinkers would help build up believers by explaining to them why their beliefs were correct and attractive in the face of hostile, ridicule from the surrounding culture, played a big role in helping to give believers confidence. And then seventh, philosophy is essential for the task of integration. And integration, as people try to think through how to apply the Christian faith to their workplace or to apply the Christian faith to their discipline in school. Okay, a second question that I put on your sheet is that where are Christians active now in philosophy and ethics? And I put something on the sheet from the Society of Christian Philosophers, because that is a group that has been perhaps more responsible than any other in the last 50 years of making a renaissance in Anglo-American philosophy, both in the United States and in Great Britain. The thinkers who are part of that comprise not just evangelicals, but Roman Catholics, other mainline denominations, but I'm going to pass around a book that was popular when I was in college about philosophers who believe, just making visible the Christians who were outspoken about their faith in Jesus, but also their academic work in philosophy. The second link on your sheet is the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and I put a little picture up from their website. If you go there, it's a nice website because the first 30 seconds actually pans from this little portrait of like someone doing philosophy. Maybe that's Socrates, maybe that's Paul preaching in Athens, but then it ends up panning to the cross at the top of a building, sort of trying to show how evangelical philosophy is trying to point people to the cross, not just their own intellect. Now, I love this society partly because it is more recent and it was very popular at Biola. The guy who I went to school with at Biola, who is now a professor in Kentucky, he is the president now of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. His name is Michael Austin. And let me say two other things. Reasonable faith I put on your sheet because the individual who is responsible for that website is one of the authors of Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. That individual is William Lane Craig, and some of you may have heard of him before, but I encourage you to check out that website because he has a lot of very short videos and audios of not only him talking about things, but really high quality sort of 2-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute presentations of good arguments for the reality of God, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and they are, I think, the best of its kind in this sort of thing. And he's like someone who has not only written, but is constantly speaking in churches and other places around the world. Okay, so what's my short story as a Christian in philosophy and in ethics? I've given you sort of a timeline showing you some schools and churches and mentors, and I italicized the authors that were most relevant. But I can say that from birth until college, in 1998 when I graduated, I lived in Bloomington, Indiana. But it wasn't really until college that I began to walk with Christ and study philosophy in that order. In college, I had read several things by some Biola faculty and Talbot faculty, and this is something that is online that Campus Crusade for Christ puts up called Meet the Prof. I'm not sure if I've been able to, I'm not sure if Kyle twisted my arm into doing this or if it was one of our common friends that twisted my arm into doing this. But you only get a paragraph there. I'll give you a couple more tidbits than that has. But I was especially intrigued when I was in college by a book that I read called Love Your God with All Your Mind. And this book was by J.P. Moreland, who taught at Biola. And he said their graduate program at Biola had the dream or the goal of trying to send 100 evangelical students into doctoral programs around the country to eventually become professors themselves. So the spring semester of my senior year in college, my talk about where I might go to seminary was kind of focused on playing it safe. Geographically, I was going to go to a school in Chicago, which is close by to Indiana, financially and vocationally. But my soon-to-be wife, my fiance, Heather, asked me a really good direct question, as she is wont to do. She said, Russ, you know, if you only had a semester or a year or two to go to any graduate school in the world, and God did not promise you any more school than that, where would you most want it to be? And my answer was Bedia. I said, well, I'd like to go to Biola In their Master of Arts Philosophy program, of course, I'd like to study with J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig and some of these other folks who are there. So Heather told me we should just go there and forget about playing it safe. So Heather and I got married, and we moved from Indiana out to LA in the summer of 1998. Now, once I was in LA, by the end of my first year there, I read 2 key books that my teachers there had written. Yes. One of them was called Body and Soul, Human Nature and the Crisis in Ethics, and the other one was called Bioethics, A Christian Approach in a Pluralistic Age. And after reading these books and taking the classes with these professors, my main interests began to really gel around the overlap between ethics and that other branch of philosophy I mentioned earlier called metaphysics, especially as it connected with contemporary bioethical issues. So I became convinced I should try to get somehow a doctorate in philosophy and somehow end up teaching philosophy at a university, hopefully like a state school. So, let me tell you what happened next. Yes. I always like to bring props so that people can be distracted while I'm talking. It makes me feel better, like, okay, they're reading books, they're not just checking the King's score. So what happened is that in 2001, after my 3rd year at Biola, I applied to Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and I managed to get accepted off of their wait list on the very last possible day. Now, while I was at Bowling Green, I ended up completing my dissertation in 2006, and then I began my current job immediately after getting my PhD. So let me pass around 2 other books. One is the Introduction to Ethics book that my Biola professor, Scott Ray, has written, which I think is the best introduction kind of book of its kind. He's a philosophy Christian professor at Biola, and this is like an introduction to ethics, like a freshman levels class. So I'll pass this around, and then I'll also pass around what ended up being my dissertation that turned into a book. So it's what I kind of write on in my own sort of research. Yes. Okay, so my time as a student finished up in 2006, and then I've been at Cal State Sacramento since then. I was hired at Cal State primarily to teach classes in our department's major concentration. We have a concentration in ethics, politics, and law. And I was asked to play a role in contributing to our department's Center for Practical and Professional Ethics. So a couple highlights of what's happened since then. From 2006 to 2012, I kind of took charge of organizing and coordinating visits of scholars who were coming to the campus as part of our ethics center, and directing our fall ethics symposium on different topics. Then about 2010, the most outspoken atheist professor in our department, who was a friend of mine, who ran a kind of atheist-themed blog and taught an atheism-titled class, he agreed to debate me on the resurrection of Jesus at a church in town, in Roseville, Bridgeway, during its Wednesday night service. And both my friend and I thought it went well, and we decided to debate each other in a more extended way on campus. So I was already giving him some feedback on chapters of a book that he was writing, and so I said, look, you pick any 3 chapters from your book and we'll do a triple header, okay? 3 debates, 3 days in a row. You go first, I'll respond, and we'll try to use the auditorium of the Student Union building. And we did it, and it went well. So around 2011, I started teaching our department's bioethics course every semester to about 100 upperclassmen. And for a while, this class was filmed in a television studio on campus when they were trying to broadcast TV classes instead of doing online classes as much. In 2012, I taught a class on the questions about how should we best think about what good people are, and how can we reliably become good people ourselves? I'll talk more about that with some slides in a minute. In 2012, I did the normal routine of going up for tenure and promotion. That went smoothly. And since our department chair was stepping down in 2012, then the director of our ethics center rotated over from her directorship to become department chair. And so the colleagues in my department said, well, why don't you take over as the director of the ethics center for a while? Then, since 2012, a lot of other things have happened, but I'll wrap this up. I became department chair in 2016 when our department played musical chairs again, right? The current chair decided to become a dean, and so the department said, well, why don't you take a turn as being the department chair? So in Sac State departments, chairships are typically 3 years long, but you can be re-elected. And so I'm currently finishing up my first year of my third consecutive term as chair. So, I mean, I may get some time off for good behavior, I'm not sure, but I feel like God has been very kind to me, very good to me in many ways, and I have to often pinch myself when I think about how God walked with me from the time I was a college student, reading that sentence in the book, Love Your God with All Your Mind, until now. Now, let me go on and talk about who do I assign as a Christian when I'm teaching philosophy and ethics to undergraduates, right? I'll pass around 2 books to finish up the little researchy talk part of my talk, because I'm going to really be focusing on my teaching in the next couple of minutes. So these are 2 books where one of them is like a Christian book of lots of different chapters, and I got to contribute one. One of them is sort of a general book that has both Christians and non-Christians, and I got to contribute 1 chapter along with my friend who's the president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. But in terms of like teaching stuff, the rest of these slides are going to talk through an assignment that I've used in my Introduction to Ethics class that I thought your group would find especially interesting. I've talked about this before to other faculty on other campuses, because Kyle and I are part of like a faculty commons ministry that Campus Crusade does, where we kind of network with other people and share what's going on. So there's a version of this somewhere on the internet, but these are tailored to you guys. There's this Introduction to Ethics class that uses a couple different books. And I think I've got a stack of these right here. We use Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, the Dalai Lama's book, Ethics for the New Millennium, and then C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. We also use a nice short history book by 2 Calvin College professors, The Story of Ethics, and we use a contemporary book by Julie Rubin called The Making of the Modern University, which has to do with what are the transformations in American universities that deal with ethics teaching over the past, 170 years. And then we use Dallas Willard's book, The Divine Conspiracy, which many of you have heard about or read. Sorry, I'll give the whole stack to you guys. Take your time. I'll put it right here.
Okay, thank you.
So, what's kind of interesting about this class, because otherwise it just looks like a lot of books that we read, right? But I wrote a short little paper about this assignment I'm going to describe that's available online. It's a paper that's called Assigning Virtue in the Secular Academy. It's at the Evangelical Philosophical Society website. They had a project on how to be a Christian in a secular academy, and lots of different professors contributed some insights about their experiences. So this assignment is called a Personal Moral Inventory and Experience Project. Okay, so there's one word at least that connects, overlapping with EPIC, right? Why is it called a Personal Moral Inventory and Experience Project? Well, here's why. The very first thing that students read in my class is a short article that asks this question: what is the point of knowing about what's good unless you keep trying to become a good person? Now, in the context of a short article, this question that I just posed comes from an anonymous female student who was sitting down to talk to her college professor. It's a Harvard psychiatrist named Robert Coles. And this little article that Coles writes about his experience talking to this student and his inability to answer her persuasively is an article called "The Disparity Between Intellect and Character." Now, this particular conversation between the student and Coles gets discussed in one of our classroom books by Dallas Willard. It's in the very first chapter of The Divine Conspiracy. Some of you are nodding because you may remember it. That's the conversation with a college student and Coles. So how does the personal, moral, inventory, and experience project come out of that? Well, here's how I describe the project to students. I say this project has two parts. It's got an inventory part and it's got an experience part. Each student I ask to do 3 detailed inventories of things about themselves. And here's the 4 things that I ask them to look at: their strengths, their weaknesses, their opportunities, and their threats. Now, some of you are recognizing those words, right? But what? It's their strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats in being a good person. Now, you might wonder, well, how do I define a good person for this assignment? Well, we'll get into that in a second. But the thing about these inventories is I try to have them do the first one at the very beginning of the term, the second inventory I do at the middle part of the term, and the third inventory I do at the very end of the term. And so each of these inventories includes 2 parts, and this is where it gets a little bit nosy for some people, but it's not me being nosy, you'll see. The first part of each inventory is what I call a first-person snapshot, in my own eyes. I want the student to reflect on what they see as their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, okay? So the second part, however, is a third-person snapshot that I ask them to find a trusted friend or family member who can give them a snapshot, and I call this a third-person snapshot in the eyes of another, okay? So in addition to this inventory part of the project, there's an experience part of the project. And the experience part of the project works like this. I ask them to pick some cluster of virtues that they believe are relevant to being a good person. Okay, so I recognize each student may come at this question saying, oh, well, I think a good person is, these 6 virtues or whatever. And others may say, oh, well, I've got these Christian virtues, faith, hope, and love, and so on. So I give them flexibility in choosing the virtues for this particular assignment. And then I ask the student to develop a plan for trying to grow in these virtues over the course of the term, and then report on their experiences of following their own plan at the beginning, middle, and end of the term. Okay, so what happens here? Well, the end of term report tries to give a more detailed plan for growing in these virtues and other virtues once they leave the course. And then, this chart kind of basically shows you the reports that I asked for, right? An inventory in their own eyes, an inventory in the eyes of others, an experience report, both at the beginning, middle, and at the end. And so the basic idea of the inventory I explain to students this way. Look, a business can often benefit from taking an honest inventory of its own assets, its liabilities, its income, its expenses. So too, any individual person can benefit from regularly taking an honest inventory of their own moral beliefs and their moral attitudes and their moral behaviors. Same thing with businesses, benefiting from having both an internal audit and an external audit done by an outside accounting firm. An individual can benefit from having both a moral inventory of themselves in their own eyes and in the eyes of another whom they know and trust. Okay, so the beginning snapshot just asks students to answer 5 questions about themselves. First, what's your definition of a good person? Right? What attitudes, character traits, and patterns of behavior do you believe define a good person? You'd be surprised at how much convergence there is on this without me even needing to take a heavy-handed approach. Secondly, what are your moral strengths? Or excuse me, what attitudes, character traits, and patterns of behavior do you already possess that make it more likely that you will consistently succeed in being a good person as you have defined that? What about moral weaknesses? Okay, what attitudes, character traits, and patterns of behavior do you already possess that make it less likely that you will consistently succeed in growing as a good person as you've defined that? Likewise, moral opportunities would be what situations do you reasonably expect to encounter in the next 6 weeks that will give you excellent chances to succeed or grow in becoming a good person? And what situations do you reasonably expect to encounter? These are the moral threats in the next 6 weeks that are going to present obstacles or challenges to succeeding or growing and being a good person. Okay, now some of you guys know already where this comes from, right? I got the idea for these questions because as a student, when a teacher in my business class introduced me to standard SWOT analysis, SWOT is just an acronym for strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. And it comes from some studies at Harvard and Stanford done in the 1960s, and you often see it presented in a chart like this, right? The internal elements are the strengths and weaknesses, the external elements are the opportunities and threats. And so basically, the In Your Own Eyes part of this project just asks students to identify their own answers to these 5 questions. And in the eyes of another, this part of the project asks students to try to recruit one of their friends or family members to answer a version about each of the 5 questions about the student. Now, I'm not going to go through all 5 of them, but here's how one of them looks, right? Here's an example. In the eyes of another person, you're going to take this to your mom and say, Mom, answer this. What attitudes, character traits, and patterns of behavior does this student, Junior, believe defines a good person? And, what attitudes, character traits, and patterns of behavior does this student, Junior, already possess that make it more likely that he or she will consistently succeed or grow in being a good person? A lot of people will do this with their roommates. It makes it a lot of interesting reports. Students will sometimes do this with their boyfriend or girlfriend. That also makes some interesting reports. But so far, I've really explained the inventory part of this project more. Let me talk some more about the experience part of this project, because students actually like this part even more. So, C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity says this. He says, "No man knows how bad he is till he has tried very hard to be good." Now, I actually put this quote up there for the students to see, and they all laugh and think about it. So I tell students that the experience dimension of this project really involves conducting a sort of moral experiment upon yourself by trying very hard to be good in some specific areas, okay? Now, how? Well, by making a serious attempt to practice some cluster of 4 virtues. Each student gets to pick which virtues to focus on, and I ask students to pick virtues that they do not already find themselves practicing easily, right? And so here's the examples I typically give them. I say, look, for example, if you are already a very patient and kind person, then but you're not already a very honest or courageous person, then it would be better to focus on the virtues of honesty and courage for this project. And here's why. I explain one of the rationales for picking a virtue that they don't already find themselves practicing easily comes from what C.S. Lewis actually says in Mere Christianity about humility. Lewis says this: "You may remember that the first step towards humility was to realize that one is proud." Lewis says, "I want to add now that the next step is to make some serious attempt to practice the Christian virtues. A week is not enough," says Lewis. "Things often go swimmingly for the first week." Students like the word swimmingly. "Try 6 weeks," says Lewis. Okay? So for the beginning of the report, I basically require students to answer these questions for each of the virtues they choose. I say, look, what's this virtue you're going to pick to focus on? Why are you picking this particular virtue to focus on? And what's your plan for growing in this virtue? For example, so given these open-ended instructions that I give them, students can pick all kinds of virtues to practice. And for example, the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you an alphabetical list and tally of about 90 different virtues that about 120 students chose for themselves back in the spring of 2013, 10 years ago. The most frequently chosen virtues in this list of 90 were courage, honesty, faith, love, and patience. But you'll also see some other interesting ones here. There's justice, joyfulness, strength, sincerity. Charity got 3, chastity only got 1. Better than 0, right? Anger management got 1. There's a lot of other kind of interesting ones that people come up with. But I don't give them a long list, and I just let them pick, right? I mean, we've been talking about virtues throughout the whole semester from Plato and Aristotle and Christian virtues, faith, hope, and love. So they've got lots, battling around their mind. But they also had, I got 1 vote for modesty too. I'm not sure why that one came in there. Thrift was one of them, time management, tolerance, trust, truth, trustworthiness, and so on. Okay, so for the middle experience report, I basically quote another part of the C.S. Lewis passage quoted earlier, and I asked them several questions. And again, this is not me rubbing in like, the depravity of man, right? I'm just saying, look, listen to what C.S. Lewis says and listen to your own experience here. Here's the quote from Lewis. He says, "A week is not enough. You may recall things go swimmingly for the first week. Try 6 weeks." Lewis says, by that time, like by 6 weeks, having as far as one can see fallen back completely, or even fallen lower than the point one began from, one will have discovered some truths about oneself. Lewis says, no man knows how bad he is till he has tried very hard to be good. A silly idea is current, says Lewis, that good people do not know what temptation means, and this is an obvious lie. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. After all, you find out the strength of the German army by fighting against it, not by giving in. You find out the strength of a wind by trying to talk against it, not by lying down. Lewis continues, a man who gives in to temptation after 5 minutes simply does not know what it would have been like an hour later. That is why bad people, says Lewis, in one sense know very little about badness. They have lived always a sheltered life by always giving in. We never found out the strength of the evil impulse inside us until we try to fight it. So, given this Lewis quote, I ask students, to answer the following questions in their middle report. I ask them, look, what specific steps did you take to make a serious attempt at practicing the virtues you chose? What situations gave you opportunities to practice the virtues that you chose? What got in the way of your attempts to practice the virtues you chose? Were you relatively successful in practicing the virtues you chose? And why does your experience make you think C.S. Lewis was correct or incorrect in what he says about trying very hard to be good? So the ending report asks students to write about their experience with virtue, both looking back over the semester and then looking forward over the rest of their life, or at least the next phase of their life. Now, in my experience, at the end of the semester, if not sooner, both Christians and non-Christians in the class will thank me for assigning them the task of cultivating and reflecting on the virtues that they themselves get to select. Now, I haven't actually done this class or this project for several years. And I think it would be very interesting to see if the virtues students choose now will be different than the virtues that they chose back in 2013. But I want to close with one short story from a particular student. And I wrote about this. Kyle and I are twisting each other's arms to write for the Faculty Commons of Campus Crusade in their missional moments in January. And it's got this little open sign because this talk, this little anecdote comes from an idea called opening minds. And it starts off this way. Eliab, not his real name, was an older, taller, tougher, gruffer, and grislier student than any student in my introduction to ethics class before or since. Eliab's silent, steely-eyed stare from the middle row a few feet in front of me felt like a wall. While I knew what God said when Samuel thought David's brother Eliab was just the right size to be king, right? The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. See, my problem was that my Eliab was different than David's and Samuel's Eliab. But it was similar. I thought that Eliab's appearance made him unlikely to be open-minded to God. So, with all too little faith, I tried to sow seeds in Eliab's life and my other students' lives in ways that fit the content of my course and the character of my classroom. For example, the first day of the semester, I made it a habit to casually identify myself as a Christian, and in explaining the goals for my classroom, I said this: I try to convince my students that respectful tolerance, critical thinking, and firm convictions are not enemies but allies. As G.K. Chesterton said, the point of having an open mind, like the point of having an open mouth, is to close it on something solid. During the semester, I assigned some students readings on both Christian and non-Christian thinkers on ethics so they could compare for themselves C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity and Dallas Willard's Divine Conspiracy with Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism and the Dalai Lama's Ethics for the New Millennium. I also read to the class the opening story from J.P. Moreland's book, Kingdom Triangle, to show how different worldviews might handle the same data. In this case, it was an apparent answered prayer from an African child in a missionary context. And then the last day of the semester, I put this question on the in-class final. Compare and contrast Plato, Aristotle, and Jesus on the question of what ethics has to tell us about living well in relationships and communities. Now, Eliab's answer to this question was 3 pages long, and it floored me. He wrote movingly about his marriage, his family, and his journey from doubt to believe in God. The African child story impacted him deeply, and it prefigured something similar that would happen in his own life that semester. He wrote, "Ethics was meant to open my eyes about the existence of the greater power of God. He preordained this class and my participation in it. God has taught me through this class about his involvement in our lives. He has a purpose for all of us, and I'm excited to see what he has for me in the future." Eliab finished with a line on his final that both reminded me of Chesterton's quote and humbled me for my own little faith. He said, "You will not open everyone's mind, but you sure have opened mine." Now, actually, I think Jesus opened Eliab's mind, but graciously used me to do it, just as Jesus opened my mind, but graciously used Eliab to do it. Indeed, I think what this story of Eliab shows is that we never know what is going on behind the walls that our students or our faculty colleagues or our others on campus may put up in front of them. But God has a way of seeing through those walls and into the hearts of those around us. Eliab was a reminder to me that I should never assume that people around us are closed to God's work in their lives. For what he opens, no one can shut. Revelation 3:7. So I'll close with reminding you about Calvin and Hobbes, the great cartoonish Swiss reformer and British philosopher. And then I'd like to thank you for listening so patiently, and I hope you have some comments or questions.
When are your classes?
Yeah, I teach every year, so I always welcome visitors. I always welcome people who want to come and
Oh,
audit.
people can visit?
Yes, they
Oh,
can.
wow.
Yes.
That is very exciting.
But we have ethics speakers every fall and every spring, and we have a symposium every fall that's sometimes on a themed topic, like ethics in politics or something. Yes.
What level of class? Is that an introductory class or is it, yeah?
Yes, the one that has this inventory experiment has been my introductory ethics class. It usually has mostly freshmen and sophomores in it, although upperclassmen are allowed to take it for general education credit as well.
You mentioned that you haven't taught this class for 10 years or whatever.
That's right.
What do you think the reaction would be today? Because it seems that we're moving full speed ahead, pushing ethics aside, whether it's Washington or the military or government or whatever.
Yes.
So I'd be curious to
My anticipation is that the virtues that people would pick would be different. They would focus on maybe certain virtues on that list more than others than they did back 10 years ago. But I also think that even if people are sort of viewing this project like, oh, I get to sort of customize my own virtues for myself, I think that people would still buy in and be willing to try it. They'd be willing to say, okay, I'll give it a shot, right? Even if I'm not going to practice the virtues that C.S. Lewis thinks are the most important ones. You know, I think that this came up last month. There's this great Christian writer named Carl Trueman that talks about how expressive individualism is a very powerful, like, movement of ideas now. And it's the kind of individualism that says, I want to be given a lot of freedom to express myself and my own views about life and good and happiness. And this kind of assignment, in some ways, it doesn't directly challenge that expressive individualism, but it kind of says, look, even if you are an expressive individualist, you can play along with this assignment. And then hopefully this assignment will at least show you that, look, even by your own standards, right? Even by your own standards of trying to customize the kind of person you want to become, you're going to realize you don't live up to even your own standards. And I hope that that will be enough of a prick in the conscience to like help people realize that the Christian doctrines about sin and grace are just as relevant as they have always been. Yes.
Why did you stop teaching?
Oh, my duties as department chair in some ways took away my responsibilities for teaching those classes, and so I've been teaching a biomedical ethics class, which, you know, I've got some books up here for that too, but I've been teaching some biomedical ethics classes to students in like the health sciences, and they tend to be upperclassmen, very more like professionally motivated. They like know they want to become a pre-nursing track or a pre-physical therapist track.
Does somebody else teach the course? Or?
Yes, I mean, this is a class that we teach every semester in several sections. So there's nothing preventing me or others from rotating in through it.
Is it always taught kind of like this? I'm sort of stunned, I guess, that that you can say that you are a Christian and that there's so much Christian value in it. And I don't know if I'm just naive or if that's what.
Well, I would tell people that you want to be careful when you're teaching a class like this, because not every department on campus might be as welcoming of the innovations that I've made in this class, even though my experience has been that Christians in philosophy departments all across the country often have a lot more flexibility with what they can have on their reading lists, what they can say in their own classrooms, what kinds of interesting assignments they can give their students to like reflect deeply on topics like this. So in some ways it's a department specific thing, like to philosophy in any institution, you're often going to get a lot more flexibility. But yeah, I would tell Kyle, be careful if you're going to try to pull something like this in your astronomy class. You need to make sure that it actually fits with the syllabus as well.
Yeah. He always says, I'm always glad when I have Christians here because then I can say what I want to say.
Oh, right.
Something
Yes.
like that.
Yeah. Understood. No, but I mean, the way our department works, we have peer review of every class. So like other professors from my department sit in on my class any day that they want to. They write up a report about the whole semester, about the whole syllabus and everything. And I've had no pushback from my atheist colleagues and others about this assignment or this class.
That's very
This
good
reading
news compared to what you read in
Right.
newspapers a lot.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, sir. Oh, yes. Hal.
I told you I was gonna ask you.
Good, good.
you talk a little bit about where the assignment fits in the scope and sequence of your course, and how you, and talk about the development of that, because that is such a reflective, interpersonal kind of assignment. And it seems like for a freshman or a sophomore going into a philosophy course, it seems like it's a, let's jump in the water
Yes.
and see how you do.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. The students in my freshman classes, I mean, I've taught an assignment like this, I think, since fall of 2006 when I first showed up. And they never cease to amaze me at how they kind of show up to college. I mean, the phrase my mom used to use is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Like, very enthusiastic to try things out and say, okay, I'll dive in with both feet in my classes. And so, in some ways, if I give them this on day one, say, okay, this is what we're going to be doing, they're all on the same page, they're all in the same boat, they've all got this, zealous teacher that wants to help them to think about how this class is not just abstract history, but it connects up to the warp and woof of their daily life. They're willing to play ball. Now, I think that as the normal arc of the semester goes on, and they get more and more assignments, and they get tired, and they sort of have the normal sort of running out of gas experience about 10 weeks in.
Oh, you're reading such
Yes.
easy stuff, Russell.
Right. Yes, yes. I do tend to be kind of what they call a softie when it comes to grading, like assignments, like quizzes and papers and things like that. I say, look, if you can't read all of the stuff that I've assigned for you, that's okay. Just come to class, we'll talk about it, and you'll still pass, as long as you keep showing up.
Yeah, that is cool. So does that mean is the completing the assignment somehow means the outcomes, the intended outcomes for the class, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it connects up with the typical course learning objectives about, reflecting on different ethical theories and their application to today's life and stuff like that.
But not in that academic, here's the outline and, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, this is a harder paper. I mean, I'm not saying ChatGPT can't do it, but I mean,
That's right.
I wasn't thinking about ChatGPT when I did this. I mean, most people don't want to plagiarize about, it sort of goes back to the Calvin and Hobbes question at the beginning, right? Right? Nobody wants to really plagiarize about this, getting their mom to write a letter for them. Not cool, Mom. Yes.
How did you deal with philosophy or logic instructors that were antagonistic of your Christianity, or wouldn't hardly listen to you about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my own experience, both in my undergraduate years at Indiana University and my PhD years at Bowling Green State University, certainly had its fair share of professors who, carried a chip on their shoulder against Christian beliefs for whatever reasons, right? Sometimes they grew up in a pastor's household and they felt like, I'm shaking this stuff off and I don't want to see you around here. But really, most of them were able to keep it at a very sort of low level and keep it within the sort of professional zone, right? It's sort of like, okay, I understand your views. I understand you're a little bit snarky in some of your lectures, but I was fortunate that I think I just had a good mix of the kinds of professors who, even if they had an axe to grind, they just didn't treat the classroom as their place. Exactly, right. I was also, I think, fortunate, some of the people's names that I put on the sheet. Tim O'Connor, when I was an undergraduate student at Indiana University, was a philosophy professor that kind of took me under his wing. And he also went to Evangelical Community Church right off campus. It was a church in many ways like Fremont. And it was the sort of place where, a lot of university students and university grad students and faculty would go in fellowship. And so Tim O'Connor was the person who introduced Dallas Willard when Willard came my freshman year to the Veritas Forum and gave 3 talks at Indiana University. They're still available on YouTube if you look up Dallas Willard Veritas Forum, Indiana University. And the fact that I had other Christians in my classes even my philosophy and religious studies classes, who are also buddies from like Crew and InterVarsity. That made a big difference for me. And yeah, I think that, I mean, Tim O'Connor, bless his heart, he had us reading. He like would pull some students aside and say, let's read something just for fun that's hard Christian philosophy. We'll get, this Notre Dame professor named Alvin Plantinga, and we'll read something by him, and we'll talk about it, just the 3 or 4 of us, even outside of the normal classroom setting. Yes?
What do other universities that are non-Christian or whatever, what do they do in their departments of philosophy? Are they taking an approach like this where they're maybe more open-minded than at least we think they are? in terms
Yeah,
of what they're teaching.
Well, my experience has been, it varies, sometimes regionally, right? Different parts of the country may reflect stereotypes to some degree about those different parts of the country. But I've got friends who are just like me, who went through the same Biola program and are now spread out all over, in the South, the East Coast, the Mountain States, Midwest, and they've had good experiences in teaching in their settings. And I should also just say, a fuller answer to your question would be, when you look at the number of individuals who are registered for the different sub-societies within the American Philosophical Association, for example, right? There's the group that studies Kant or the group that studies Aristotle. But the Society of Christian Philosophers has actually been, I believe, the largest sub-society for many years. And that's partly the result of those people like Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne and the others who were in that book, Philosophers Who Believe, just doing good quality research, good quality teaching, good quality writing. So, I am happy to say that there is a small wave, as it were, a small wave that many of us have been riding of goodwill, of momentum among Christian faculty. Again, it's not all evangelicals, right? There's the whole theological spectrum represented, but there is a good number of evangelicals in the midst of the Christian philosophers more broadly. Yes.
Is that the debate between you and the atheist pastor? Is that, or professor, is that online anyplace?
Oh, well, for better and for worse, yes, it is. So I've been telling him we need to have a sequel to that, because I can do a lot better than I did back in 2011, and so can you. I need to bait him into that. And say, we need to have a rematch here, because both of us have been upped our game since then. Yes.
How many majors do you have at Sac State?
You know what? Right now, the number of philosophy majors is right around 90. We've had it be even up into the 140s, but COVID kind of nibbled away at that a little bit. There was a time when I think the Sac State campus had more than any other CSU. I need to check on that to see whether we still have bragging rights there, but we've got a lot of minors as well. But the fact that we've got that concentration in ethics, politics, and law, in some ways makes it a little bit more attractive for people who feel like, look, I want to have a legal career, but this looks like an interesting way to do that. Yes. Oh, yes, you've got
Another question.
Good, okay.
I wondered if you would just talk a little bit about the, sort of the historical assertion that evangelicalism is anti-intellectual. Could you just comment about that a little bit?
I'll just say 2 things about it. And one is, I've heard the rumors, and they're partly true, but the historian that does more on this than anybody, I think, is George Marsden, in his writings about evangelicalism and fundamentalism. And then Christian Smith, who I think is a sociologist at Notre Dame, writes about how this has been changing a lot. I mean, I know Mark Knowles got a famous book about the closing of the evangelical mind or something, but
and that's classic, right?
right. But I honestly think it's changing a lot. I mean, there's a funny joke that maybe I should close on, because you saw from my church vita that I basically have been brought up as a Methodist. I was a Baptist for a while, and now I'm a Presbyterian. And there's this famous story from, well, not a story, it's a famous joke from A River Runs Through It. I don't know if you recall this scene with Brad Pitt. They're at a train station, and there's these three guys who are in Upper New England. I think they're all Presbyterians, and one of them says, did you hear that, like, Susie has gone off and gotten engaged to a Methodist? And the second Presbyterian says, a Methodist? What's a Methodist? And the third one says, oh, a Methodist is just a Baptist who can read. Now, that's not fair for a number of reasons, right? And totally, it's not fair at all. So even good Presbyterians in that movie sometimes make the mistake of thinking that, oh, you can paint all the evangelicals of this stripe with a certain brush. But no, there's a lot of people who love to read.
Thank you. That was so very good. I think we can have him come back and talk about another section of it. Let's pray before we go, and then many of us will stay around and you can talk with him if you like. Gracious God, thank you. Thank you for Russell's talk this evening, and for all of the things that he sparked in my mind, at least, that I want to think about and read about. I'm very grateful for the people that are here this evening and for what you've done with Epic in having these great speakers come. Thank you, Lord, for leading us. Thank you for being with us. We love you, and we want to serve and show our love for you. Bless us as we go home. Keep us safe. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.
Closed on a high note there.
Good.
Woohoo.
So forward, and
Yeah.